Hello there, it's Antrice, and welcome to another episode of the Savvy Painter podcast. This episode is sponsored by Turkel Art Supplies, and Turkel is offering Savvy Painter listeners an exclusive gift from now through June 22nd when you go to Turkel.com. That's TREKELL.com and use promo code SAVVYGIFT. You get a Turkel gift pack. For over 30 years, Turkel has been obsessed with the art of brush making, and now they are applying that same obsession to professional-grade panels and floating frames. They make everything right here in California at their Hesperia factory. I am so honored to share a conversation this week with the artist Lani Irwin. Lani is a painter originally from Maryland. She earned her BA and MFA degrees from American University in Washington, D.C. Lani and her husband, the painter Alan Feltis, have been living and painting in Assisi, Italy since 1987. Lani's paintings are a dense orchestration of mannequins, puppets, toys, and human figures, usually women. She shares the early Renaissance artist's fascination with geometry and spatial relationships. Lani often uses bold patterns, another characteristic of Renaissance art, in the clothing of her figures and in the background. In this episode, we talk about the profound effect a visit to Assisi in the early 70s had on Lani's paintings. She believes that art is a way to express the richness of what's inside of us. She talks about her process and the serenity of allowing a painting to evolve and speak to her as she creates it. Lani has had one-woman shows at the Katharina Rich Perlo Gallery in New York City, the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art in Boulder, Colorado, and Gallery K in Washington, D.C. She's taken part in group shows in Milan, Verona, London, Washington, D.C., and New York City. Here is Lani Irwin. Lani, thank you so much for being on the Savvy Painter podcast. I am honored to have you on the show. It's a delight.
Thank you for having me.
I would love to hear about your early years when you first started out painting. Can you describe for people who may not be familiar with your work how you started out as an artist? What were some of your early influences?
I mean, I always find it very difficult to try to even trace how that part of me developed. I think that we're born who we are. I think that there's all of us have a certain seed of something inside of us when we start, and it can be cultivated in one way or another. I often think that in my case that some aspect of me becoming an artist had to do with a mythology that my father died when I was 10 months old. He was a pilot and he went down landing on a carrier. And so I never knew him. But my mother would tell stories about him, and he was a painter and he was an opera singer, very different from the world that I actually grew up in. But I think that mythology encouraged me, gave me some sense that there were other roads that one could take. Early on, I think all children draw. I think in a way children draw to make sense of the world around them, to give a concrete aspect to what they're looking at, what they're perceiving in the world, make sense out of relationship. So, I did that too. Most of us did. I never really thought that I was extraordinary in that, and I didn't have a sense that I was unusual. I can remember once when I was in third grade that the teacher that I had did think I was unusual, and he did think I was very gifted. I didn't quite believe him. It was nice, and then I stopped really taking art classes at a certain point when the teachers began. I was in Hong Kong, and the teacher there wanted us to make geometric patterns and fill them in, and I thought that was an absolutely worthless thing to do, so I stopped. And didn't really, I drew, but didn't really take it to heart until I lived in Europe when I was 15 to 18, and I visited museums and fell in love with painting. And when I was then going to school, go back to the States to go to school, the only thing that I was interested in studying was painting. But I never really thought about it very much. It was really more just a life. It was the way my life wanted to be formed. I had dreams mean, always as a child, I thought I would live in Paris. And I think part of that was a sense of a kind of life, of the kind of people who would try to take what was ordinary around them and make it into something extraordinary in a way, and make it into something that could be meaningful to someone else, even if it wasn't a specific kind of thing. It was just expanding one's field of perception.
I love that. That's so interesting. So it sounds to me like you just had a vision of the way that you wanted your life to be, and art was, painting was clearly an enormous piece of that.
I mean, I could have been a dancer, and I could have been a writer, or I could have been an opera singer, but that's not the way it went. I mean, that wasn't what carried me. I loved all of those things. It had to be something, though, that was dealing with what's inside of us. I've never really thought about other kinds of work very much in terms, because I wanted a richness and I was lucky because it worked out.
Yeah. Do you think, it sounds like you moved around a lot growing up. Do you think that experiencing those other cultures and seeing the world the way that you did influenced, in some ways, that idea that you mentioned of children draw to make sense of the world? And do you think that experiencing all those different cultures, that painting was a way for you to sort of bring your thoughts into the physical piece of?
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't really know the answer to that. The one thing that I do know is that I was lonely, and I was not. It was hard to make friends. I was shy, and moving every 2 years was difficult. So there was a sense of isolation, and I another part of me wanting to be a painter had to do with, from a very early age, I think that I fantasized. I liked to live in fantasy, and I think that was again part of me, and I was perhaps pushed further into it by the moving, because it was hard. It's hard to make friends. People who live in one place have friends that, living here in Italy for these many years, all of the young people that we know, they've got friends that they've had since they were in kindergarten.
Yeah.
And they can go away and they come back, but they're still friends. And I didn't have that. And also because the reason that I was traveling, my father was in the Navy. So we weren't necessarily always in the more beautiful parts of wherever we were going. I mean, it was the only, Hong Kong was very interesting. It was fascinating. But at the same time, because I was in a British school, when I went back to the States, I skipped 2 grades, which was an additional problem socially.
Distance, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it put me again in a situation of, so I graduated from high school at 15.
Oh, wow.
And there I was. I hadn't thought about what one does after high school, because I got out 2 years earlier than I was meant to get out. Everybody else had been making plans. I hadn't made any plans. And then from there, we moved to Naples, to Italy. So then I was thrown into a completely different culture and different language that, it was complicated. So I saw wonderful things. So certainly in that sense, there was a richness. The other day, my daughter-in-law asked me whether she thought color was influenced by, for instance, living in the Orient. I think not, but it could be. How can one ever know what? I mean, the things I remember are things like cars being too large, going through the streets and knocking down stalls with fruits and vegetables. You remember a kind of chaos. You remember smells. You remember events. But to be able to know what kind of influence that had on who you become, everything does. I think everything has an influence on who we become, and how we see them is influenced by who we are.
Yeah. Yeah. And we often don't know what exactly it is that is coloring our glasses that we look through, or coloring our perceptions. I think sometimes it's obvious, but other times, as far as most people are concerned, what's in their head is reality. So there is if you question everything, you go crazy. So you have to just accept some things.
I mean, I know that when I came back to Italy again in 1974 and came here to Assisi to see the church here, I know that had an effect. Mm-hmm. That was an enormous experience for me. The frescoes in the church here were just miraculous, and it did have an effect and change the way I work. So certain things I can remember, I can sense these things. When I lived in Italy earlier, my interest was more towards Rembrandt and more towards a kind of expressive and expressionistic kind of use of paint and kind of form and kind of content, the kind of thing that moves you in a much more obvious way, in a way. There's a connection, a clearer connection to me to the emotional aspects of, for instance, looking at a Rembrandt self-portrait there is to looking at a Giotto.
Right.
Giotto
right.
has a totally different world. But when I came here and I sat in, particularly, for instance, in the chapel of the Simone Martinis and upstairs in the Upper Basilica, it was just, I felt as if one of those panels, one of those big things, if I encountered one of those in a gallery in New York, I would just be overwhelmed. And there was a whole church full of them. And they showed a kind of something that was inexpressibly magical. So I know that had an effect, and things did change from that point on. But before that, I think it's much more accumulative. I think it's just an accumulation of experiences.
In some regards, as artists, as human beings, we go through this stage where we're kind of just a sponge and we're just absorbing everything. And then, something clicks and we make a commitment to go down a certain path, or just life circumstances lead us down this certain path. It sounds like moving to Assisi was one of those really pivotal moments for you. I'm kind of curious what led you to decide to plant your roots there.
Well, the incident I was just talking about was long before we moved, 1974. Mm-hmm. But I think both Alan and I had separately and then together always assumed that eventually we would either move to Italy or at least spend a lot more time here. And I don't know whether Alan talked about it, but in 1984, he resigned from his teaching job at American University, which gave us for the first time the possibility that we could start to consider where we might live that had nothing to do with a job mm-hmm. or school. Mm-hmm. And we went abroad for 1 year, basically. We went to stay for a year, and we just never saw a reason to go back. We didn't make a deliberate decision before coming here to say, this is it, we're moving. Mm-hmm. We came for a year because other friends were doing it with their children because they were on sabbaticals. And we thought it would be good for all the kids to have had this experience together. We just never went home because there was never a reason. We're happy here. We get up every morning and see beautiful landscape. We can drive for 15 minutes and see something extraordinary. We're outside of the demands of the quote unquote art world. There are good and bad things about that, but for most part, I think that the advantages far outweigh the other because it's allowed both of us to do our work mm-hmm. and grow and develop. And I know that was important for me, and it was important for me. I wanted our sons to grow up as citizens of the world. I'm foreign here, and I'll always be foreign here. I'm an expat, but I always felt foreign in the States too. And I was an American. So it was more uncomfortable to feel foreign there than it is to feel foreign here, because I am foreign here, whereas I'm not foreign there. Mm-hmm. So it felt right to me, and I felt right for my sons to grow up here.
Beautiful. Can you talk a little bit about your painting and the subject matter that you choose to paint?
Okay. In what particular sense? Do you have a particular thought that you're wondering about?
Well, let's start with just kind of an overall view into what you choose to paint for people who are listening to this who haven't necessarily seen your work before. I think we'll probably have like half and half of people who know your work and are specifically listening to this because it's you. And then there's other people who are like, who is this person? What does she paint?
From the very beginning of my life, as first looking at painting and then making paintings, the thing that I've been most drawn to has been the personal aspect of painting. I've never been a person who thought about painting political paintings or monumental paintings in that way, things that were dealing with global issues. There are things that I put in the paintings that make statements about some of those things, but in general, like I would never think to paint the raft of the Medusa, for instance. That's just not who I am. And when I finished graduate school, I realized that the thing that was important at that point was that I've often said that I had to teach myself to paint at that point. But then what I realized is it was really more of a time that I then needed to find out what was important to me personally in painting, what I wanted to paint. Because before that, there was always somebody setting up the model or setting up the still life. So I had very little control over what I was painting until I reached that certain point at the end of graduate school. Things weren't quite as evolved as they are now. When I was in graduate school, we were all still in a communal studio. We didn't have our own spaces.
Oh, okay.
So it was very different. It was very different then. But so at the first thing I did, I had a seagull skull and I set it on top of a box. So I was just working with bare bones, something or other. I love bones. I think they're extraordinary structural objects, but they have that other part. I like things that have multiple readings. So although a bone is a beautiful sculptural form, a skull is a beautiful sculptural form to work with, it also has the other elements of what it actually is, what it was. So anyway, I started from there and then gradually began to develop a lexicon of characters that I worked from. For many years, I worked only with objects, but I did use mannequins. So I was painting figure a little bit by implication by using the mannequins. And I think I was staying away from figure at that point because Alan painted figures. And I thought, well, okay, I'm going to maintain my separateness here. At a certain point, I decided that didn't make any sense because we were going to live together a long time, and I didn't want to have to avoid something that I wanted to paint just because he painted it. So a mannequin became a figure. The objects, I choose things according to how they talk to me. It sounds a little strange, but when I started painting, years and years ago, I used to start from a setup. I don't do that anymore. For many, many years, I haven't done that. The objects that I paint from life. The figures I make up. The more complex part of the painting I don't have in the studio. The objects I do, and I don't necessarily set them up at all the way I'm painting them. I move them around. I take them out. I put them in.
Do you start with an idea and allow it to evolve, or are you purposely changing things around?
I would love it if I had an idea when I started it. It would make it much simpler. But, I start with a gesture, an object, a series of objects, and a relatedness of body parts or something. I mean, basically, you put one thing down and then you start. And often what I start with completely changes very quickly because I don't like what it is. And then it evolves. But then from that point, it's the painting that's telling me. It's a dialogue with the painting itself. What moves, how it shifts. If there's a figure in there, as I repaint and redraw and repaint, then that changes its relationship with the objects. Then an object will have to come in. I mean, when I talk about it, it sounds like I'm out there having a circus of people running in and out of the space. But, I mean, I go out in the studio and I often just have to sit there for quite a while and try to figure out what I'm going to work on today and what needs to happen, who needs to come in, who needs to go out.
Uh-huh.
The subject, the things, I can remember years ago, I used to say very, very definitively that the objects have absolutely no meaning. They are only in there for formal purposes, for shape and color. There was one point that this young critic who was in the audience when I was saying this stopped me and he said, "That's ridiculous." And then he talked for about 20 minutes, which was grand because then I didn't have to talk. But he was right. I mean, that kind of statement, I think, grows out of the way we were taught when we were in college. Because the whole generation, the people who were teaching, were coming out of that era where painting was much more based on abstraction. It was based on the formal elements. It was color, it was shape, it was form. There was no narrative. You aren't allowed to have narrative. You aren't allowed to have that kind of thing. If it was observational painting, if it was a still life, it was just what it was.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the one thing that made it a painting was the composition, not necessarily the objects themselves. And that's true. But what you choose for the objects, what you choose to put in there, I think does have importance. I just don't know what it is. I mean, I'm honest when I say that. Certain things I know. There are certain things that I'm using in the paintings that do have a reason that they're in there. But for the most part, they don't. They're other than they talk to me. Can I give an example?
Yes. Of the things that you know that you're certain about why they're there.
Well, my mother died 3 years ago, and she had bought me many, many years ago when I was with her, because people can't actually easily give me toys. The toy has to talk to me. So we were together, and she bought me this old antique goose, one of those little things that would have laid an egg.
Mm-hmm.
And I never painted it. All the years that I owned it, never painted it. Sat in my cupboard, never painted it. When she died, I decided I wanted to paint it because I was painting two paintings. They're small paintings. One of them's called Mother Goose, and the other one is, I don't remember what the other one's called right now. I'll think about it in a minute. But they're square paintings about, like that. And of course, that isn't going to say anything on a podcast like that.
No, but like that would be, looks like. I do that all the time. Like, I think people are used to it. I use hand gestures and I'm like, so I just did this thing, but that looks like it's about 2 feet by 3 feet ish.
About 1.5 by 1.5 feet. They're both square.
Okay.
So at any rate, that was one where I was very conscious because I wanted to paint that painting in a painting while I was thinking about her.
Mm.
In a way, I was attempting to work through the process of grieving by making paintings. But it's not really, they're not really grieving paintings.
Right.
It's not that. It's just that aspect of it was there. So that's one example. But are there others? Not too many, probably. It's really an interesting thing because there really aren't the rose. I have a lot of hanging roses. And I remember that I wanted to do that. And I don't know why I wanted to hang the rose, but it was just an instinct. And then once I'd hung it, I looked it up later in a book of symbolism. I never look before I do it. And it means secrecy. They used to hang, if they hung a rose in the middle of a room, it indicated secrecy. So from that point on, then obviously when I hang roses, there's a double element, but most people don't know that.
No, I've never heard of that.
And a lot of people don't know about tarot cards, and I use those a lot because I like that kind of added symbology that's there.
Mm.
It was funny. I was reading today. Alan and I read out loud. I've read out loud to the family since the boys were little. So, and Alan and I've sort of continued it. So when we drink our coffee, I often am reading. And today we were reading Train, Patti Smith's recent book.
Oh, wow. I want to read that.
It's very beautifully written, and we're not terribly far into it, but it's very beautifully written. But she was She made a statement today that sort of surprised, that I read today. She didn't make it today, that surprised me in that she said that she didn't like to look for symbolism in things. She wanted them to, like, she was reading. She was sitting in a room in a cafe, I think, and a man walked up to her and saw she was reading, I think, Brecht. I can't remember who she was reading. I think it was Bertolt Brecht. And he said, "Oh, you're reading that?" And she said, "Yes, I just read this." And he said something about the symbolism, and she said, "Oh, she thought it was quite enough just to be involved with what was actually being said without getting involved," which surprised me because she seems so incredibly rich in what she says and what she thinks that I wonder whether that was true. But I like the undercurrents and the overcurrents. I like to have the objects or the paintings have more that's there, even though I don't necessarily understand what it is. It's like a dream, it's like what we think with a dream. We'll wake up and we think, oh, well, that was such and such. And then as you start to tell it, it dissolves and it becomes something else. And you don't have any idea why those two things happen together.
But when you were dreaming it, it made absolute sense.
Made absolute sense. Even when you woke up, it made sense.
Yeah.
But 1 minute later, it no longer makes sense. And to me, the paintings are like that.
Yeah, it's almost like I've had that happen so often with dreams. I don't often remember my dreams. And so when I do, I'm just like, I'm kind of excited. But when the second that I try to verbalize it, it just disintegrates.
The only way they say you can do it is if you have a tape recorder that comes on as soon as you start to speak, and you just speak it immediately when you wake up.
So fascinating. So I'm curious about your work. I feel like when I look at it, I feel like there's an overall story that's being told, but I just don't really know what it is. And maybe that's kind of like that dream thing that, like, when I see it, I feel it. And then if I try to put it together, I can't. But I'm wondering, with all of these objects that you're putting in and the symbolism that you sometimes add, if you're having a recurring dialogue with some of these objects that you're putting in or the figures that you're putting in.
For me, a recurring dialogue, the way I would understand that to be said, might mean that I would have some conscious understanding of what it is they're doing. And unless you mean, do I keep going back to the same thing? I do, but I don't really there's not an understanding, an overt understanding of any kind of really specific narrative. There's a sense. Yeah, I agree. There's a sense of a narrative there.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I wish I could understand it because I think I might understand myself better. But I've never had any kind of intended narrative or intended meaning to anything that I've painted, any way that I put things together. And I've never really thought about what meaning a viewer might have. I've wanted them to respond. Mm-hmm. Very definitely, I've wanted that. But I've never prescribed how I thought they would. More recently, I've wondered whether that's really what they're about, is that inability to make that kind of decision, to make a decision about what they're about. That doesn't make any sense, actually. But
in a strange way, it kind of does. That it's just this exploration that you seem very at ease with not knowing precisely what things are about. Is that an accurate statement?
I think so. I'm not a religious person, but I'm a person who believes that there's a great deal more to ourselves and to life than things that can be easily described or written down or listed. That was, as I said, that when I walked into the church in Assisi in 1974, I felt like I could understand that there definitely might be a higher power of some sort, that there was something else that was guiding the work in there. And I think that for an artist, for a painter or a writer or a musician, the best thing we can do is get out of our way, basically, so that we can be in touch with that inner part of ourselves that is thus in touch with the other inner parts of other people. We can share that kind of aspect of ourselves, if we're lucky,
Mm.
I think that often people today think that they need to make something new, that they're, novelty is the way of life now, and it's making a commodity that will sell, and to do that it has to be something that nobody's ever seen. I don't believe there is anything in art that's never been seen. I don't think there's anything new in art. I think it's been done from the very beginning. The only thing that's new would be what you would make or what I would make, because it's us.
Yes.
If we can be in touch with ourselves.
If we can get out of our own way.
Yeah.
This episode is sponsored by Turkel Art Supplies. Turkel Art Supplies makes custom panels from their factory right here in California. High-quality panels are made to order and shipped directly to your home or studio. Choose from lightweight gator foam panels, birchwood panels, or aluminum. Here's Pro Team artist Sean Cheatham talking about Turkel panels.
The first time I used just their straight wood panels that were gessoed. But what I've been really liking is their linen, oil-primed linen on either dye bond or gator board. The ones on gator board are so light, which I love. I brought a bunch with me to Rome, and I don't love painting on linen anymore. I think it's beautiful and fancy and all that stuff, but I like panel. I like smooth panels, but those linen panels with the oil grounds I was very impressed with, and I think actually ended up being some of my favorite paintings consistently that I did in Rome when I was maybe only doing 1 in 4 on those panels. I love how light they are, and I think the glue that's removable anyway, so you just get the linen if you want to remove it later. But for traveling, it's amazing. They're so light.
So because Turkel loves Savvy Painter listeners so much, they are offering you an exclusive gift. From now through June 22nd, when you go to Turkel.com, that's TREKELL.com, and you use the promo code SavvyGift, you get a Turkel gift pack. So to claim yours, you just go to Turkel.com. Again, that's TREKELL.com, and use promo code SavvyGift on checkout. I'm curious, throughout your time painting, I guess that idea that you're so at ease with the not knowing, I find a lot of comfort in that, probably because I'm not that way, that I always want to know. I'm very curious, and I try to figure things out, and I guess I'm constantly searching for answers. And so I think that's why I guess comforted is a good way of just kind of okay, there is a state that you can get at where you're just okay with it. And you don't, you can just absorb and be and allow things to appear on your canvas. But I guess my question right now is, do you feel like you've always been that way, or was getting to that point an evolution?
Well, first of all, I think if I'm understanding what you were saying, I think one has to separate knowing and knowing. The paintings are very, I spend a long time making them, and the things find their positions and they find their forms very specifically. So in that sense, there is a knowing. There's a very deliberate engagement with the reality of the painting itself. The part that I am comfortable not knowing about is understanding why they're all there together. The fact that they are is part of the reality for me. That's part of what I work on. I every day I go out there and I paint the hand next to the whatever, or the this or the that. And that's the part of the unknowing that I'm comfortable with, is more the narrative aspect, or the quote unquote meaning. Mm-hmm. Because I think that meaning is non-specific. I don't think there is a specific meaning. Even when one looks at an Annunciation or crucifixion that have a specific story, the way that they're put together carries something else. So, but anyway, but your other question about whether I've always been that way, I would say probably in the beginning, I might have been more deliberately obscure. I liked metaphysical painting. I like early De Chirico. I like Carlo Carrà. I like Fausto Pirandello. These are all painters who painted in the period between the wars. And then the early Renaissance, late Gothic, early Renaissance Italian paintings that I like so much have similar kind of element where, you have things that are flying, you have continuous narrative, you have objects that don't necessarily make sense. So when I was younger, I think that there was perhaps more of the sense that I was more deliberately creating that kind of metaphysical, difficult to understand, ambiguous kind of relationship. I think that as the paintings developed over the decades, I think that they became more that way by themselves. Mm. Now, of course, during that period where it was perhaps more deliberate, I was also not painting figure. And I think when figures come in, I think that there's a different sense of reality. Mm. Objects, I was creating stories and dramas using only objects before that. And I think that that's different once the figure comes in. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, I think it does. And that's an interesting observation about what happens when you add the figure into a painting, that it changes.
Well, when I've become aware of the fact that even, for instance, I paint primarily female figures. Mm-hmm. And I think there's multiple possibilities for reasons for that. One of them is that I'm a woman. So that's, and the paintings relate to me. So that's more comfortable. And also female figures have interesting forms. But one of the things that I noticed years and years ago, a Danish artist friend asked me why I never painted men. Mm-hmm. And I had not even thought about it. I hadn't even thought about it, which is funny. Mm-hmm. So I thought, okay, well, I'll paint a man. But then as soon as I painted a man and a woman in the same painting, everything changes, because then you've got relationship. Yeah. And that's hard, because that's a difficult kind of thing to maintain without a narrative. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want a narrative. So why I didn't want a narrative, I don't know. I mean, a narrative could be really interesting to work with. I've often thought in recent years, God, it would be wonderful to work with narrative. Why can't I work with narrative? I love it when people do. I'm fascinated with it. I really do. But I don't. That's one of my limitations, I think, right now. It may not be next year. Who knows? But right now, it still eludes me. So when you have a male and a female figure, even when you have two figures, you've got relationship. Mm-hmm. But when it becomes a man and a woman, then that adds another level of relationship that is even more complicated.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
How to balance that is very hard. So
yeah, there's a different perception. As soon as you have one person and you add another person into it, there's that changes everything. And then when you make it a man and a woman, it's even more, because I think as human beings, we look at it and we try to understand what's happening, right? And so then our imagination immediately begins to make things up and fill in the blanks for ourselves and make up stories about what's actually happening. That whole perception of what happens when you change just that one dynamic. And that goes back to just the fact of, working with objects and then putting a person in, that changes everything about how you perceive it.
It does indeed. It really does. And if you put two men, it changes things too. Yeah.
Can you tell me, what is a typical day for you in the studio? How do you actually start one of your paintings, or what does your studio time look like? Does it have any sort of pattern or ritual that you go through?
Well, as I said before, often I go out there and I sit down and I look at books for a little bit. I look at the painting, and then if it's not immediate, oftentimes from what I've done the day before, it's clear what I'm going to do the next day. Or sometimes I've solved a problem in the night and I know that I'm going to change this color when I get up in the morning. But if that's not the case, I sit and I look at some books and I think, and I look at the book and I look at the painting, and I sometimes feel like I'm trying to sneak up on the painting to kind of surprise it, I'm not really here,
Don't mind me.
Don't mind me. I'm just here trying to get in. I also, now, one of the things I do is I fold a paper crane the first thing I go into the studio. It's like a little meditative routine that I do. I used to, for many, many, many years, I worked anywhere, I often worked an eight or even 10-hour day. I don't work as long now as I used to. I don't have the same stamina that I did. I'm not as young as I once was. So, I often go out in the morning, but I may not start painting until after lunch. And I have a lot of other things that I like to do. I have a big garden. I remember listening to Langdon talk about that, and he has his big garden. I have a big garden. And now, for instance, it's a very busy time of year. I have a lot of other interests things I like to do, things I like to make. It's just sort of never ending. But my routine in the studio is more or less to go out there, fold a paper crane, maybe look at a book, and then start painting. And depends upon the stage of the painting. When I'm beginning a painting, it's a lot of days in there with a blank canvas. I mean, it really is very, very rarely do I have a clear sense of what I'm going to do for a long time. I just have to kind of work through it. And
what does that look like when you are facing the blank canvas? Are you literally sitting there kind of just staring at a blank canvas and thinking about what you might put on it?
Well, I do that intermittently with looking at paintings and looking at images and and sometimes I go through and look at pictures of my old paintings, because sometimes I find something that I want to resolve differently. I've done that a couple of times where, how when you're working on a painting, every choice you make sort of dictates the next choice. So if you make a different choice, it's going to have a whole different path. It's going to become a different painting. So I've done that a couple of times where I've enjoyed that. But in general, it's really just sitting there looking at the painting, looking at perhaps old drawings, old sketches that I've made, looking at pictures, looking at anything I can look at, taking a walk, coming back, leaving, coming back the next day. I mean, really, once it started, it's a whole different situation.
Yeah.
Once I make the decision to start with one thing, one figure, one object, one space, one thing, then, you're kind of off and running, because then you're reacting, you're responding to what you have. But to decide what size you want to work on takes time. And oftentimes, in recent years, my figure scale has gotten bigger. So I'm finding that it's often difficult for me to fit what I want to do in the canvas. Mm. Now you might say, why don't you just paint a bigger canvas?
Why don't you, Lani?
But we've actually, both of us kind of got into a certain kind of size because of being able to carry it back to the States. So that sort of limits things. Also, I've been having difficulty with my hand. I'm having some mechanical difficulties with my hands, so I don't really want to get too much bigger so that I can't manage what I'm doing. Mm. But anyway, that's how I start. And then I repaint. I start with a very limited palette in the beginning. I basically start with white, yellow ochre, Venetian red, and blue. It's just kind of, that's it. And then it takes me a long time even before I add any other colors, because I just keep moving things until I get it to where I think it's going to stay, and then it never does. Mm. It always has these sudden shifts until it stops shifting. And one of the problems I have now that my gallery closed, so I don't have any shows set up. So the paintings are staying here, which means if I take it out and look at it again, I might start working on it again. And then it becomes a different painting. And then I look back and I say, why did I do that? And other people say, why didn't you just start a new painting? But at the time, it seemed like a good idea just to make that little adjustment that then ended up complete repainting. But there's nothing really very specific in terms of my routines and my procedures. I'm basically, you just have to be there and just work. Mm-hmm. I loved listening to Susan Walt talk about the moon cycles.
Yes.
I thought that was fascinating. I just thought, oh, how marvelous. And I remember Isabel Allende said she always starts her books on, I think, the 21st of January.
Huh, I never heard that.
It's just a marvelous thing to have that kind of thought process that you can just move all that energy to that pivotal point, and then it just takes off.
Yeah, it's kind of an external, I mean, you sort of alluded to this idea that there's this ramp up time before you actually start making marks. And once you make the first mark, then the second mark comes. And, so there's that. There's a lot of thought and a lot of, just sitting there and thinking and looking and before you start making. And the thing about Susan Walp's comment and about Isabella, that you have this external thing that says, okay, on the 21st you go, or when it's the full moon, you go. And so It kind of takes that pressure off of you in a way. It's just like, okay, it's time. Let's go. It's planting season. It's time to put the crops down. There's no more thought about it. And there is something kind of nice about that. Although I think I'm more, I'm more internal than external, but maybe I need an external push every now and again.
Well, but one thing I should add to the Isabel Allende thing that I really loved is that she was saying this. I was listening to an interview with her, and she said, and then the 20 whatever day it is came along, and I sat down and started writing an entirely different book than the one I thought I was going to write.
Right.
So even though she had the startup date, she didn't write what she thought she was going to write, what she'd been planning before the startup date.
Which is kind of like your paintings.
It is. It's like what we're all like. I sometimes think it would be nice to have a set schedule, set ritual, set thing, but I am who I am, and I do it my way. Mm-hmm. The only thing I don't do is paint landscape, which you do. And no one can understand why I don't paint landscape, since I live in this extraordinary landscape.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yes, you do. However, you also live in a place where you can go and see all these frescoes, and you go and you see all this amazing work. And if I lived, near all these great pieces of art, I don't know if I could paint landscapes. You know what I mean? Like, the pull would be so strong.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I live right now where there are these beautiful landscapes around me, but there's not that other piece. Those figurative artwork it's pretty much devoid of that where I am. There's no museums, there's no galleries, unfortunately. And so it focuses my attention on the landscape. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's strange at all that you focus on the figure, even when you live in the middle of beautiful landscape country, is all that was to say. I'd love to know, from looking back at your own work, where you sort of started with these explorations and where you are now. How do you feel like your work has changed? I know you talked about already the fact that you focused mostly on objects and then started adding figurative work when you felt like, it was silly not to do that when that was something that you were clearly attracted to. But I'm wondering and this may be a question that goes nowhere, it might just be a simple no, but I'm wondering if you see in your own work a thread that runs throughout it of something that you've been exploring.
That's one of those questions that I think I would needed to think a lot about.
It's kind of like asking you what the meaning of life is, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a little bit like that. I mean, and did you have have an additional addendum to that question?
To make it not so. Another way to approach it, I guess, is maybe in the opposite way. Is how do you feel like your work has changed over the years?
I guess in a lot of ways, I don't really think that it has. I mean, other than it just keep evolving. What I think in response to what you're asking is more or less what I've said earlier on, that I think the thread running through the work is just me. And I don't know what that part means, because as I said, I think that we remain pretty mysterious to ourselves, even though, I've spent a lot of time reading people like James Hillman and Jung and Larissa Pinkola Estes and all kinds of people who are attempting to help us to understand ourselves. And I think we remain mysterious because I think we are kind of mysterious beings. But I think the consistency through my work is, I guess, exploring that in a way, in all the different ways that that I'm able. I ask myself a lot of questions, and I really do. I've got reams and reams of journal writing where I'm lamenting and asking myself questions, but I very rarely come up with any answers that make any sense. So I realized when I was answering a question in an interview that about narrative and illustration and that kind of subject, that I think that a lot of us were made to suffer a great deal by being told we weren't allowed to have those things. And maybe we would know more about what we were doing if we had been able to accept that it's a natural and normal aspect of painting to have these underlying things. But I'll have to think about that question. You should write it down to me after we finish this so that I can ponder it, because it is an interesting one to think whether I can see a thread other than just my own meanderings. I can look at the world that I've created in my studio of objects and of things that surround me and in my house, and I can see a consistency in the inconsistency. I can see that I like complexity. I like putting disparate things together. It challenges a part of myself, and it excites me. It excites me to do that. And I guess that exists all the way through the work. And the paintings of mine that I'm less interested in have less of that. And right now, for the past few years, I've been kind of, in a way, letting loose, and I'll put anything together with anything that I want to and not even think about it. Whereas I think I was a little more considered before. I think I might have put the skids on myself when I was getting a little bit over the top. If I wanted to put too many stripes and too many things in there, I might have said, calm down, Lani, calm down. And I think I'm not doing that anymore because a lot of years have passed and I don't have any reason to do it anymore. I can just enjoy myself in my excesses.
Yeah.
And I don't have an excessive life, but I can be excessive in the stuff that I put in the paintings. I can just add one more thing.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
And I guess I really don't have an answer to that question other than what I've said. That was a really interesting question. I like it.
I think what you said makes sense. And it is I think it's a very difficult question because it's almost like, I don't know if you have this experience, but like I see myself every day in the certain context of in the mirror when I wake up in the morning and I'm brushing my teeth or whatever. And then sometimes I'll see a photograph and I'm like, is that me? Like you almost like because you see yourself every single day, you don't notice the gradual changes until it's almost like the camera puts it in a different perspective or something so that it's somehow different. So I guess where I'm going with that is, as a painter, it's sort of your evolution for you is so kind of gradual and where you're trying to go with it. And so you have a different experience with it than a person who might see one body of work and then another body of work and then is able to like say, oh, here, X, Y, and Z, A, B, C, here's all the changes that have happened in the work. But it's what I'm often so curious about is as an artist over, decades of painting, there's the vision that we have inside of us and then what comes out on the canvas. And there's often a gap and we're always trying to close that gap a little bit, I feel like. And so you have the benefit of knowing what your intentions are versus what actually emerged.
When you're speaking of a gap, or you speaking about, I speak about we're always confronting our limitations. And I think that's what keeps us going. I think that we keep persisting because we hope that the next one is going to be the one. That's going to be the one that's going to. I've gotten to the point now where sometimes I've even thought that this might be my last painting. It's an odd thought, but part of it is, I'm getting older. but it never is because, and sometimes I even think I don't have another painting in me. I don't know what, you asked about what motivates you, what keeps you going. Sometimes I wonder whether there is, but then there always is, you finish the one and then you do find the next one.
Mm-hmm.
So far I have, it may, there may be that day, but one thing in terms of evolution, I remember that for years, brushstroke was very important to me. And then eventually brushstroke, I didn't want to be the dominating thing anymore. I didn't want the paint itself to be that. I wanted the shapes and the forms and that kind of thing to be the dominating form. But it's been that way for a long time. Mm. And then for a long time, I would worry that I had to be able to paint a whole thing in one day because I couldn't break it. And that's why sometimes I would break things with clothing or I would break things with a ribbon because then I had what was called a giornata in the painting. So I could paint from the shoulder to the wrist and then I could paint the hand separately. I worry about that less now. I don't know why, but I proceed differently than I used to. I used to have a set way where I always went back, and when I was to my finished layer, I would sort of go from the head to the shoulder, the torso, and to the objects and to the wall. And now I'm just whatever feels right for today, I work on, and if I don't get it done, then I work on it tomorrow. And I'm just a little wilder, I guess. I don't seem very wild, but I'm a little bit less, I'm less concerned. I guess I'm letting them be more who they are, even more themselves than they were before. And I think they've always been themselves, but I think they're even more themselves before because I don't need to think about who's going to see them.
Interesting. Uh-huh.
Because I don't have a show schedule, so they just are here and I can just let them be.
And have fun.
I'm having a lot of fun, yes. The thinking is still the same, but I'm just more relaxed with it in that sense, which is nice.
Yeah. It sounds like that, there's a level of comfort that we get as we mature, I guess. Like that, just thinking about some things that used to that I would worry about or would make me really uncomfortable. And then just to put it like in a really kind of superficial, if you think about like as a teenager, how important it was to me what my friends thought of me. And now I love my friends, but I don't care what they think about me, And
that's good.
and we talked, before we started about doing the podcast, and I was saying that when I first started, I was terrified. It was really scary for me, and I would worry about how my voice sounded, and I would be really worried about the questions I was asking and how the guest interpreted those, or like, oh my God, am I going to sound really stupid if I ask that? Or is that too personal? I would be really second guessing every single question. And I'm just like, kind of whatever pops into my head, I'll ask you. And if you don't want to answer it, that's fine, So I don't worry about that anymore. So it kind of feels like what you're describing in your painting, is similar in that sense, that when you start off as a painter, people typically are very concerned about technique. Mm-hmm. Is the drawing good? Is the color good? And then they start worrying about composition. And then, all of these things start becoming big concerns. And I think slowly, as you gain some proficiency in it, you either become so skilled at it that you don't worry about it, or you make a decision that that's not important for your work. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of sounds like, that's a similar thing, that you've just come to this point with a lot of things in your painting that you've decided it's irrelevant and you're no longer going to worry about it, or,
No, the only part I'm not worrying about is what anybody thinks. That's the only part the same, all the other parts are still the same thing. I still labor over painting a hand and all of that, but I'm just only concerned about what I think now.
Yeah. Which is beautiful, because it's kind of like getting out of your own way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It changes once it's finished. Then you kind of hope somebody else is going to respond to it the same way that you do. And it has been so that's been good. But
wonderful. That conversation may have just answered the next question I want to ask you to sort of close this out. But what advice would you give to younger artists or younger artists in the sense of where they are in their painting journey? So like somebody who's just starting out as a painter.
Well, I think the most important thing is to not get involved in the novelty aspects of the art world, to only think, to really go into yourself and try to really find out what's important to you and just work hard. You have to be there. I mean, I worry when I haven't taught a lot in the past in the recent years, but when I was in Baltimore an academic year with an endowed chair, and when I was there, I felt a sadness about how many of the students who are so young were thinking that they had to be able to come up with a body of work. And I'm thinking, a body of work? Takes years to get to that point. But everything has changed so much that I think they believe that they have to do that. And they believe there's something that they can do that's new, that's never been done. And as I said before, that just isn't there. So work hard and spend time with yourself and not get involved in that other part of it very much. It's very hard because it's being pulled by media. I think for young people today, for young artists, young people in general, the mass consumerism is such an overwhelming thing. To be able to find what you think and what you feel and how you see is really, really difficult. I think much harder than it was earlier, because I think that many of us grew up with the idea that we may never sell a painting in our whole life, like many of the painters that we respect from the past, and that the important thing was to do something that was meaningful. And I think so much of that has shifted now. So that would be it, I would guess.
Lovely. Lani, thank you so much for talking with me and exploring all these ideas with me. I had a lot of fun. I hope you did too.
I did. Thank you very much. You made it very interesting.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Thank you again to Lani Irwin for such a wonderful conversation. To see examples of Lani's work and for links to other artists mentioned in this episode, just go to savvypainter.com and click on the podcast tab. You'll find the show notes for Lani's episode there. So for the past 3 years, just about every week, I have been working hard to bring you tips and techniques to help you out in your studio, in-depth interviews with artists who are gracious enough to share their stories. And by sharing their stories, they show the rest of us that we are not alone. Each of us has a role to play in this community. So now I want to take a moment of gratitude to thank some very special people in the Savvy Painter community. So a big thank you goes to Janet Lido, Fine Art, Ross Hogan, Fifth House Interiors, Avery Endow, Philip Stone, The Roaring Artist, Alexis Redden, Elizabeth Gessius, Suzanne Sullivan, Kathy Beeler, Helen Van Stoke, Maureen Nathan, Charles Hess, Adrian Morgan, Robin Smith, Amy Fitzgerald, Susie Anderson, Taylor Mason, Ellis Andrews Art and Design, Gail Height, Barry Koplowitz, Art of Joy, Miles Lewis, Everyday Original Art, Meredith Adler, Barbara Mowry, Winslow Art Center, Carolyn Fessenfeld, Francis Sills, Linda Tenpenny, Zotsheets Shui, Miss J. Quinn, Shirley Williams, David Farmer, and Judith Cross. Thank you so much for your contribution to this podcast. I am so grateful for your help. Also, I am super, super excited to let you know that the Savvy Painter podcast has passed 1 million downloads. It was so exciting. I was at LAX dropping off my brother-in-law and his wife, who came in from Argentina for a surprise visit. And boy, did they surprise us. But anyway, they were there to witness. I checked my phone and saw 900,999 downloads, and it flipped over to 1 million. So excited. Such a great milestone and just something that's really, really cool because honestly, when I started this, I had absolutely no idea that it would go on this long or have the impact that it did. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your contribution to that and for all of the amazing emails, comments, and letters that you have sent me since I asked you to. You guys have just blown me away with your response to this podcast. I am so humbled and honored to be able to serve you. Until next week, this is Antrice Wood with the Savvy Painter Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.